Here's a quick game art history video to help us talk about game art styles a little bit more accurately. My name is Joe Marabello. I've been working in the industry for 20 years and I run Terrible Posture Games. That's it, here we go. The first game art was actually vector math done by the engineers who made these early games, and there was no images here, it was all done by math. And even the screens of the time weren't using pixels yet. Of course, text was being used to play games as well too, and engineers found creative ways to use text to make art. Basically, we call this ASCII art nowadays. And this game right here is Rogue, which is where we get the roguelite genre from. The first games came out in the early 60s, and it wasn't until the late 70s that we finally got games like Space Invaders here that had pixel art. It took us a long time to get good at pixel art. There were no art tools back then, and engineers were oftentimes still doing the art. When there were artists, oftentimes they were working on graph paper and then handing things over to the engineers to input into the code. You can look up Mario creator Miyamoto to see examples of this. Over the course of about 15 years, we got better and better at making pixel art. The tools became more sophisticated, and the job of game artist became a thing. And I have a theory that when you have stability like this in a tool chain, then that's when you start to see mastery and you start to see experiments in art style. And one of those experiments I want to talk about is called pre-rendered pixel art. This is where you would actually create traditional pixel art, but using non-traditional methods, like actually capturing video footage or claymation. We'll come back to this again later. In the early 90s, things began to change dramatically as we finally got to be able to do 3D in real time, even if the results were super simple. This is the flat shaded or faceted look, meaning there was no textures and all the shading from polygon to polygon was done as a flat color or a smooth gradient. And the shading between polygons was really sharp, hence the term faceted, like a faceted gemstone. It should go without saying that the tools to make this art were terrible, and you needed to actually have really expensive SGI machines to even be able to make it. And to run it, you needed a strong machine. One way around this was to actually go back to pre-rendered again, where we would render out everything ahead of time and basically make them still images for the player to interact with. The game Myst was basically a web page you were navigating through with pretty images. You can see a similar idea in some console games where we would pre-render 3D images into sprites, just like the old pre-rendered idea from before. Except we began shaking up that idea by pre-rendering the background and having the 3D characters be live and dynamic. We still couldn't do a whole lot in the way of actual textures, especially on consoles. However, we could use vertex color and smooth shading to create more definition in our characters. That's what you see here. And by the end of the 90s on consoles, we'd gotten way better at that mix of pre-rendered background and real-time characters. It's important to stress here that the background is 2D. It's 3D on the developer's machine, but then rendered to 2D for the player. Only the characters and simple collision are 3D. Meanwhile, going back a few years on PC, there was the opposite approach occurring, where we were taking 2D sprites and mixing them in a 3D environment. Well, a faked 3D environment. This is actually a 2D plane that is then using things like parallax scrolling and sprite scaling to create the illusion of 3D. But we very quickly were able to actually texture map onto the surfaces here to make it look even more 3D. But true 3D, like having one room on top of the other, were impossible using the 2.5D techniques at the time, without some trickery. And consoles did play around with 2.5D a little bit as well. Here you can see the Mode 7 graphics on Super Nintendo, where the ground plane is rotating and scaling. But it's got a long way to go compared to what we were doing on PC with 2.5D. And then in the mid-90s, we finally got real-time texture mapped 3D. And this is when I would say the history of game art on the 3D side actually really begins in earnest. Between 1995 and 2003, 2004 or so, we had another period of stability where, although things were improving dramatically and rapidly in terms of what we could do and in terms of the tools, the actual tool chain and what we were building was just getting more refined. We were not changing. Over on the console side, things were going the same way, although lower resolution and without texture filtering, which is what gave the PS1 its crunchy look. And we did begin getting a little more sophisticated with our shaders too. Here you can see the walls have an environment map on them to make them look a little bit reflective. And here you can see early cell shading, at least on the characters. This was too expensive to do on the entire environment. Although we could do outlines on the environments to make everything still look kind of cell shaded. Or we could color our textures in a specific way to make it look stylized. Or even mix geometry techniques with texture techniques to create cool looks. This was a time in game art where the color map or the diffuse map led the way. And games that are built this way can still look good today. Here's World of Warcraft around when it launched in 2004. And here it is closer to today, looking gorgeous. Now, there are specular maps also in World of Warcraft, however, the diffuse is really king in that game. And then this game happened, Doom 3, and this was the beginning of basically normal maps. It was not actually the first game with normal maps, but it was a transition game. Now, we had been messing around with bump normal before, but it was not in the same way that Doom 3 was. Normal maps basically fake 3D information by baking it into a texture map that is then used to influence the lighting on an object. And suddenly now, the diffuse map is no longer the king, because all the lighting information is taken from the normal map, so you have to actually paint a color map without lighting in it. There was a short-lived period where we actually tried to generate these normal maps using height maps that were generated by hand. We called them bump normal, and you can see them really on walls and floors of games in the early 2000s. This Halo example is really good here on the floor. But the proper way to make a normal map is to make a higher resolution mesh and then take the curvature information from that and basically bake it down onto the lower polygon mesh. So it took us a long time to get the hang of normal maps and sculpting, but once we did, we had another period of stability where, while the technology was changing and improving, we were able to actually get good at these tools again. Just take a look at how much better we got at making sandbags you could crouch behind. And that said, it didn't last too long because then PBR came along, which is physically based rendering. Here we used real-world properties to define our materials. Instead of diffuse, normal, and spec, now we had metalness, roughness, normal maps, and albedo to deal with. This is another paradigm shift, but now we were aligning with film and with physics. So if things change now, at least it's changing both industries. The PBR workflow first popped up about 13 years ago. That makes this the longest period of stability in our art tools and processes, at least during my lifetime. And it was the last major paradigm shift. There have been improvements since then, of course. The shift to ray tracing, the idea of using Nanite and Lumen to do more real-time stuff without as much fakery. But those haven't changed the way that we make art. It's just allowed us to make more detailed versions of the art we already make. Here's what I mean. These two games were made 20 years apart. And these two games were 10 years apart. But these last two, which use the same basic art pipeline, were 13 years apart. If anything, the last decade or two have focused more on the accessibility of the tools. Anybody can make games now, regardless of whether or not you're doing something in the PBR workflow or any of the other techniques that I mentioned today, which are all still valid and in use. I just think it's helpful to keep in mind a little bit of history when you're talking about art tech and art style and where they intersect. And all that said, I still don't know how Night Trap fits into all of this stuff. Also, quick credit to all the YouTubers that I pulled footage from so I can make this video quickly.